Peter Travis is professor of English at Dartmouth College, holding the Henry Winkley Professorship in Anglo-Saxon and English Language and Literature, where he teaches courses on Old and Medieval English language and literature. He is author of the seminal Chaucer, Rereading the Nun's Priest's Tale, which won the Warren Brooks Award for Outstanding Literary Criticism. We have that book, and it's out. I made the mistake of putting it out. Somebody checked it out. That's the point of a library. It's not here for you to see. It's due back on Friday. Check in then. Of himself, Peter says, "My primary academic interests are medieval literature and contemporary critical theory. I teach courses on Old and Medieval English language and literature, and developed and taught a course on contemporary masculinities called The Masculine Mystique." He received a Master's of Literature from Trinity College, Dublin, a Master of Arts from the University of Chicago, and a PhD from the University of Chicago. He has described his approach to Chaucer as coming from three different directions: a close reading of the text, examining the relationships between a text's ideas and its form, between what a text says and the way it says it, as in the manner of the new criticism of Robert Penwarren and Clent Brooks; an appreciation of how Chaucer and his readers were trained in the liberal arts, particularly the study of grammar, logic, and rhetoric; and by forms of high theory criticism, such as that of Jacques Derrida, because it corresponds to Chaucer's own training in logic and his ability to deconstruct a sentence and have, quote, "a fascination with language, but a suspicion of language's secrets." Liberal arts, how refreshing. Please welcome Peter Travis.
So as I was just coming up in the elevator, met a couple and found immediately that one member of that couple has a PhD in medieval literary studies. And I said, oh my God, I don't think I have sussed out what my audience was going to be like. I am not going to approach Chaucer as I might in a very, very scholarly environment. I'm not going to deal with Derrida and high theory. I don't have the time to do extraordinarily close readings of Chaucer. But I do want to go through an awful lot of Chaucer rather rapidly to articulate my appreciation for his genius. I've given my whole life to the study of Chaucer. That book took me 25 years to write. It's 500 pages. It's about a little tale by Chaucer. But I do think that he is as remarkable as any poet writing in English in the canon. How much Chaucer is known, except for people in this audience, well, I don't really know. But the first, we have some handouts here. Everybody has one. Halfway through it, you see that there is a cartoon from the New Yorker just a week ago. Chaucer on Lena Thrie. No, I assume that means, I mean, they spend a lot of time, the New Yorker, deciding what they're going to include as their cartoons, that the New Yorker readership gets it just like that. Could you all for a moment indulge me to sort of raise your hand? How many of you, no embarrassments or anything like that, not a humiliation game, except for our gentleman who already has a PhD in medieval studies, how many of you studied some Chaucer in high school? Okay, about half. Anybody study it at the next level in college? Look! Do you hold your hands up some more? That's remarkable. And how many got PhDs? Yes? Can you tell us?
At University of Rochester, I just
Oh, yes, yeah. Yes, yeah. With Tom Hahn?
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
okay. Well, I'm in a group of medieval ringers. I realize that. And I'm not going to satisfy all of your intellectual powers of discrimination. Chaucer, I have been spending a little bit of time reading about his life. I've tended to sort of stay away from it because I'm such a literary person. But a book just came out called Chaucer's Tale about a very critical moment in his life, a critical year in his life. And just to give you a sense of who the man was, who we would not have known anything about had he not been a poet. How many people have read Wolf Hall? Or seen the BBC series, okay. So if you took Thomas Cromwell as a kind of counterpoint to who Chaucer was in his career 2 centuries before. So Thomas Cromwell in the reign of Henry IV, he starts off as a pauper, as the son of a butcher, and yet incredibly, he gets an extraordinary education. He goes to Italy, becomes very learned, very savvy, a diplomat, moves in closer and closer to the center of Henry IV's court, and then becomes his closest advisor and stays there. Nobody very happy with him being there, can't read him, a kind of marginal figure, but always has a sense of the appropriate move to make. Until finally he made, well, I don't know if he made the wrong move, but there was a wrong move made in the political circumstances of his time, and he was beheaded. Chaucer was better off economically. His father was a vintner. He was well educated, we know, because you can see it in his works, but we don't know if he went to a university. He seems to know a lot about law, but we don't know if he went to the Inns of Court. But at an early age, he became a page in the royal retinue of Edward III. And it was a rather important position to be, but many other people were squires in that same royal retinue. And he held a number of positions over the course of his years, as first of all, as a factotum, working for the king as an overseer of the forest, working in a position which was extremely important as the collector of customs for wool being the most important product of the country. Very importantly, as an ambassador to Spain, and then 3 times to Italy. He was in Parliament for a very short time, although he was not a member of the landed gentry, and he did not have wealth. He lived in cool digs at Aldgate, which is one of the gates of the city. It's this recent book I mentioned called it The Man Cave. He lived in a man cave, and he was able to see people coming in and out of London all the time. His wife was more prestigious than he was socially. They didn't seem to be living together all that much. She was in Westminster and in the court. He was in London. But he managed to survive some very sticky moments, not only the Peasants' Revolt, but a kind of semi-revolution against Richard II that Richard II survived. He was only 14 years old at the time. Chaucer was a little bit too friendly with some people that Richard didn't like, but Chaucer did survive. He left in 1386. He was thrown out of the man cave. He went to Kent. And that's when he started writing the Canterbury Tales for the last, say, 14 years of his life. And he ended his life very close to Westminster Abbey, where he was buried. And if you go to Westminster Abbey, you'll see, it took some time for this to happen, that he is honored in the Poets' Corner, all right? So quick, that's his life. But we remember him not because of his political life, but because of his poetry. He was never recognized as a poet in his life. One French writer honored him as a translator, so he was known in France as a translator. But he was extraordinarily productive as a writer. And I should mention, as a writer in English. He made a choice to write in English. You were a polyglot if you were a member of that inner circle of intellectuals and clerks and men and women of power in London. You had 3 languages that you had command over, which were Latin, French, and English, right? Because Latin is the language of all learning. It's the language of the church. It's the language of the law. It's the lingua franca of the intelligentsia all over Europe. French, because this was not always the case in England, because 1066 and all that. The Normans came in. They became the power group. All of the Anglo-Saxons were shunted aside and became the dominant language for law and for the court and for literature from the end of the 11th century up into the middle part of the 14th century. Chaucer just, of course, had command of those three languages, and also because he had traveled to Italy, he had command of Italian. That was more unusual. It appears, or it's clear, that when he went to Italy, he got his hands on some books. Books of literature written by Dante, hardly known in England at this time. Chaucer really essentially brought Dante back to England. Boccaccio, the major Italian influence on Chaucer. He used one great tale or narrative written by Boccaccio after another and transmogrified them into his own work. And Petrarch as well. And he uses some of Petrarch's tales in his own Canterbury Tales. So he was able to, when he gets to the Canterbury Tales, to write, having been influenced by a number of literary traditions. Not to forget entirely his native English tradition. He chose to write in Middle English, but there was something before Middle English called, Old English or Anglo-Saxon. And since I want to talk a little bit about the rhythms of his Middle English, here is the first poem in Anglo-Saxon or in English to have survived, to have been inscribed, okay? This is called Cadman's Hymn, 8th century. So you ready to hear some Old English? Nu shullen cherian heaven reaches ward, mea todes machta, and his mod je thank, werk wuldervader, swa je wunder je was, itche drichten, after theode, firum foldan, freya almichti. Got it? How does it sound when you think of Indo-European languages? German. And it is German through and through because English is German through and through. It is a poetry which was oral formulaic. It was poetry a little bit like jazz that was construed, invented on the spot, but according to very complicated rules of composition. It's the same thing, it's a different kind of tradition, but it's still oral formulaic with Homer, etc. Okay, it is not a literate tradition. You did not have to be able to read to write that kind of poetry, or I should say, to compose that kind of poetry. By Chaucer's time, poetry was still read aloud. You would, if you were sat down to read poetry, you would read it aloud to yourself. That was the only way people understood that one read. But nevertheless, it was a very bookish and literate and inscribed kind of tradition, which Chaucer was involved in with his manuscripts, with his scribe. Just 7 years ago, we discovered who Chaucer's favorite scribe was, because he has a poem to his scribe, Adam, who he complains about Adam doing such a terrible job with the manuscripts, but he shows up, Adam Pinker's. Chaucer's early poems, I'm going to tell you a little bit about 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, were dream visions, influenced by a great French tradition, where typically the poet, the dreamer, the I, would be reading a book. Then he gets bored of the book and he falls asleep. And then in sleep he has a dream. And as we do tend to do, at least with literary dreams, finds in the dream all sorts of issues from his living life and his reading life coming to the fore, but getting sort of scrambled up and explored. The first one is the Book of the Duchess, which is an elegy, a very unusual elegy about a woman whose name is White, and clearly, finally, we can align her with the first wife of John of Gaunt, whose name was Blanche. The second one, and Chaucer was probably in his 30s by this time, is The House of Fame. 3-part poem, where in the third part, suddenly an eagle descends on this I. I'm going to use that word a lot, I, je, moi, I figure, Chaucer, And an eagle comes down, lifts them up, and takes them way, way, way up into the heavens. A kind of parody of the Divine Comedy and a whole lot of other space travel poems that were very popular in classical times and in medieval times, but turning it all upside down. What happens in the Divine Comedy is you get up higher and higher and higher into the Imperium, and you begin to hear the music of the spheres, and everything is extraordinarily, perfect, harmonious Christian order, and everything finally makes sense. Chaucer goes up, all he hears is more and more noise. Chaos, 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 chaos. The third dream vision poem is the Parliament of Fowls, which is a debate poem. They love poems about debates. How did you, when you were in a medieval grammar school, how did you conduct yourself? By debate. You learned to debate back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. You see it still today in the British Parliament on TV. They also love bird poems. So the Parliament of Fowls is a poem about birds debating. But what are they debating? It's a St. Valentine's Day occasion. And what's at issue is love, nature, sex. What are we here for? And all the birds of all the different castes or striations of bird society from the top to the bottom, almost the top to the bottom, know why they're there. They want to hook up and fly away. It's only the aristocrats, the aristocratic birds, the eagles, who 3 male eagles all have their eye upon one formal eagle, one female eagle. And they are debating with each other. I loved her longer, I loved her purer, I loved her this way, I'm a better poet, and so on. On and on they go, until finally this allegorical figure of nature comes along and says, what you, I mean, this is very unusual for medieval literature, what are you? He asks the female eagle, what do you want to do? She says, I think I'll wait for a year. And everybody else flies off, everybody else is happy, except for the aristocratic, courtly lover birds, okay? One more poem before we get to the Canterbury Tales. Troilus and Cressida. Does that ring a bell with many of you? Okay. And Shakespeare, Troilus and Cressida, Shakespeare turns it very, very dark. Very, very dark. It's Chaucer's longest poem by far. It's absolutely a masterpiece. Without blushing, I would say it's the greatest love narrative in the English language. The greatest love narrative in the English language. I just taught it, I'm sure, for the last time last year, and I'm still recovering from the extraordinary power, sadness, beauty, joy, depth, and on, and realities about what love is. Okay, so and when I teach at Dartmouth, I teach a separate course on Chaucer, everything else but the Canterbury Tales, and half of our 10 weeks are given over to the Troilus and Cressida. So that's what, Chaucer had written that much. He would still be recognized as a premier poet. So equal in achievement to Shakespeare, equal in achievement to John Milton, equal to Wordsworth, equal to, you keep on going. Louise Gluck, okay? But we're here to think about what Chaucer is best known for, and that is the Canterbury Tales. So let's turn again to the handout. And this is where we're going to become a wee bit interactive. See, okay, ready for making some fun sounds? I guess it's the third sheet the final sheet in your handout is the general prologue. We'll pause here as I say a few things, and then we'll make some Middle English sounds. The Canterbury Tales, Chaucer's major work in the last 15, 18 years of his life, is or are a collection of tales, narratives, held together by a frame. The idea of a frame narrative was not entirely alien to the medieval literary imagination. That is a collection of stories. Boccaccio, whom I mentioned, wrote the Decameron. Aristocrats from Florence fleeing the plague go up into the high country and entertain themselves over 10 days to tell 10 tales, each of them over those 10 days. So they come up with 100 tales. There is some individuation of who they are, but only that much. They have names. Chaucer's doing something somewhat similar. But one of the extraordinary things he has done is he has, decided that I'm going to really flesh out who these tale tellers are. So he introduces, this is the frame to these tales, each one of these people who are going to ultimately tell a tale. And each one of these portraits is a tour de force. They are called fictiones, all right? Descriptions of a type character. And these types of characters each represent, they're not given very often proper names, a different profession or vocation in the Middle Ages. We'll get to them in a minute. So this is one of the things that Chaucer, oh, see my tie here? There they are. Okay, there are all the pilgrims who, in the manuscript we're going to look at in a minute, are each individuated and put up next to their to the respective tales. That's an imaginative breakthrough. Another imaginative breakthrough is that they're going to be put in motion. That is, each one of these tale tellers is involved in a pilgrimage to Canterbury, from the Tabard Inn in Southwark, just south of London, to Canterbury Cathedral. 30 of them have, just by be fortune or be chance, come together to this inn, and overnight they develop a fellowship. Chaucer is one of them. And they decide that they're going to go together, partially just for the purposes of protection, but also because they can have the pleasure of each other's company, and because the owner of this inn, one Harry Bailey, our host, decides he's going to come along with them. Harry Bailey becomes a rather important figure. He's like one of those people who always take us over when nobody else is quite going to fill the vacuum in time. Okay, very powerful, very masculine, very in your face, very loud, very logorrheic, very much a controller. So he says, yes, in order to pass the time, let's tell tales. We'll tell 2 on the way out, and then we'll tell 2 on the way back, each of us, and then you'll all have another meal at my inn, which of course you're all going to pay for as well. Okay? So, how many are ultimately told? That would be how many tales? 120? I think this is a little bit of Chaucer's inside joke. Okay, if Dante is going to have 100 cantos, I'll outdo you, I'll have 120, all right. Only 20 are told on this trip, and they actually never quite make it to Canterbury, which I think is profound in its own right. Furthermore, the Canterbury tales are not complete in themselves. They exist as fragments. Chaucer never finished. Now, what would finish mean? He never finished 20 or 30 or 40 or 60 tales. They never make it to Canterbury. And the fragments constitute a number of different clusters of tales, 10 fragments in all, that have survived in a whole congeries of manuscripts. The most premier manuscripts being the Hengert in Wales and the Ellesmere, which is what we have on our cover here, at the Huntington Library. Anybody happen to see it? I got a fellowship there, so I went and genuflected in front of it every morning. So, the frame story, everybody is telling their own tale. There are altercations or exchanges between the tales. Harry Bailey's in charge, and Harry Bailey puts another little spin on things. This is going to be a competition, all right? That is, I will judge, Harry says, who tells the tale of best sentence and most solace. Okay, most deep meaning and most pleasure. And whoever wins that will get a free dinner from everybody else. So it's a competition, it's a kind of a travelogue of tales, but it is, let us emphasize, all part of a pilgrimage. The pilgrimage, a profound ritual in the Middle Ages, a deep set of metaphorical analogies with the pilgrimage of life, and in coming all the way to the cathedral to worship before the tomb of St. Thomas of Becket. It was the most significant kind of voyage, trip, Lenten, self-purging that one could indulge in if one chose to indulge that. Of course, a lot of pilgrimages were anything but pure, spiritual, etc. In fact, there's one left wing of the church in the 14th century that says we should disallow pilgrimages because of all the bad stuff that goes on. Okay, so we are getting closer to the tales themselves, but I would like to pause for a moment to take a look at one portrait. Where are we here? Okay, all right. Because as has been mentioned in my introduction, I'm an obsessive close reader, and if we were to do much close reading here, we would take, an hour on 3 lines, which I suspect is not quite what you came here for. But if you look under our New Yorker cartoon, you will see that there is a portrait of the monk. I'm going to read it too fast, a little bit of glossing along the way, to give you a sense of some of Chaucer's nuance and ironies and art when it comes to describing a monk. And I'll translate a little bit, but otherwise you'll just have to stay and keep up with me. A monk there was, a fair for the maestria. So there was a monk, a really outstanding kind of guy. An outrider. An outrider is somebody who in a monastery is in charge of negotiating between the inside and the outside of the monastery. Who loved venery. Venery means hunting, maybe something else. A manly man, and maybe something else. The bane and ab and abel. Full many a dainty horse he had in a stable, okay? He likes horses. And when he rode, men meeked his bridle hair, jingling in a whistling wind as clear, and ake as lewd as doth the chapel bella, there as this lord was keeper of the cellar. Good enough? Okay. The rule of St. Maur and of St. Benate, that is, the restrictions and rules and orders of obedience that constituted the calling of a monastic community as defined by St. Maurice or defined by St. Benedict. Okay, what you have to do, poverty, obedience, etc., all those rules. Because it was old and some dealt straight, because it was sort of old world, a little bit too restrictive, this ilka monk let older thing espasa and held after the newer world espasa. What did this monk do? He was into the new order, right? Yeah, he was with it, okay? He was at the cutting edge of the new world, all right? He yaft not of that text a pulled hen, that saith that hunters may not holy men, nay, that a monk, when he is retulace, is licked till a fish that is waterlace. This is to saying a monk out of his cloister. So what is he saying? He doesn't give a pulled hen. We might say something else at the moment, okay? About those people who say hunters are not really holy men, okay? Or that a monk who is out of his cloister is not worth an oyster, or a fish that is waterless, okay? That does not make any sense, okay? But thilke text held he not worth an oyster. And this is why I'm sort of using this more than anything else, and he said his opinion was gold. And he said his opinion was gold. What is Chaucer saying here? I agree. Right on. I understand it. I'm with you. I'm on your side. What should he study and mock himself woe? Why should he study and drive himself crazy, right? Upon a book all the way to the cloister of the poor, poring over books, or swinking with his hands, or work with his hands, and labor, as Augustine bid? Who shall the world be served? That question he's asking. How can you best serve the world? The world is out there. How to serve the world. So this is the man who's an outrider, but he's riding out further and further. And Chaucer is saying, yes, I know he's of the new order. Maybe some of you are a little bit upset, but we must ask now how the world is best served. Let Austin have his swing to him reserved. Therefore, With Chaucer, you gotta watch out for the therefores. Therefore, he was a prickasura reed. Therefore, he was a hunter. Watch out for Chaucer's chop logic. Because he wants to serve the world, he's a prickasura reed. Grey hundes he had, as swift as full and fleet. Of pricking and of hunting for the hare was all his lust, for no cost wold he spare. He say his slaves perfiled at the hand with grease, which is a kind of very fine, it's a squirrel skin, and that the finest of a laund. In for to festna his hode under his chin, he had of goldy rocked a full curious pin, a lufkenot in the greater end there was. His head was ballad, all ball, that shone as any glass, and ake as fast as he had been anoint. I mean, he's a real shiny kind of guy, okay? Sort of a little bit, very hot, sweaty. He was a lord full fat, and in gold point, his e'en stape, and rolling in his head, that stamed as a furnace of a lade. His boat is supple, his horse in great estate. Now certainly he was a fair play lad. He was not pall as a four-peaned ghost, I'll come back to that. A fat swan loved he best of any roast. His palfrey was as brune as his aberia. So Chaucer says, I say his opinion was good, and he says, thank God he was not pall as a four-peaned ghost. He was not pall as a four-peaned ghost. What does that mean? A four-peaned ghost, a ghost would be a spirit, right? And four-peaned, like our word pine, pining away, thin, emaciated. We don't want religious like that. We want a big, fat, burly, shiny, leathery kind of vital, carnal, somatic guy, a man of the earth. But, and this is I want to sort of make one little Chaucerian point here. Who might we also think about as a four-peaned ghost in Christian tradition? Somebody who's emaciated, has a thin body, who is tortured. It's somebody named Christ. And just go to saint after saint after saint. So talk about extraordinary sort of complexity or subtlety or nuance, not crude satire, but where are you? I think if I do have a point to this presentation is what Chaucer is doing with this from beginning to end is saying, where are you? I'm not going to preach at you. I'm not going to say, aha, don't you get it? Nudge, nudge, nudge. But a four-peaned ghost. And he said his opinion was good. Now, before we get into the tales, I would like us to indulge in a little bit of reading Middle English. So, in our handout, we have in the last page, the next to last page, I got you to it before, the general prologue, the introduction to the general prologue. And where were we again? How many people have already, okay, geez. The general prologue. When I'm on the plane and somebody turns to me and says, finally, after talking an awful lot, what do you do? I have two choices. One is say, I'm a medievalist. That shuts it right down. But if I say I teach Chaucer, at least half the time they say, big smile, mandata prelude with a shoulder sota. So let's just read a few lines. Those of you who haven't done it before, just fake it, okay? You have the translation on the right and the original on the left. I'll read a line and then you read after me, okay? Juan that opera with a shoulder sota. Everybody? The drocht of March hath passed into the rota, and bothered every vein and switched liqueur, of which virtue engendered is the floor. Okay, and then a few lines together with me. Juan Zephyrus ake with a sway to breath, in spirit hath in every holt and hath the tender croppus, and the youngest son hath in the ram his half course erudda. Okay, this is the opening, the famous opening, the introduction to the general prologue, after which follows all of the portraits, the monk's portrait being one. It's a kind of very classy opening, If you want to get published in the Middle Ages, try an April opening or May opening. And I do want to remind us that while we're reading this in typeface print, in Chaucer's time, it would have looked like this. We are before the invention of the printing press. We are dealing with a manuscript culture, and we're dealing with a substance upon which these texts were written by hand, which was vellum parchment, which was animal skin. Last year, we had somebody come up to Dartmouth who is in the medieval trade of making parchment. And he brought up some parchment with some skins that he had been curing. They stank. And he brought them in and he stretched them out, and then we took off the top layer and then started scraping. It was so much work, so much work. So every one of these pages, wonderfully, they last forever. Not like paper, they last forever. But this image I have here is of the Ellesmere manuscript, very handsome, very, it's a presentation copy, very highfalutin, the top of the line, not typical of what Chaucer's other tales are published in. And if you have some time, when you take this home, you could hold up the translation and go to the manuscript and see if you can make things out. Okay, now, finally the tales themselves. They are told by a wide variety of types of people. I think I've listed them all off. For some of them, the knight, the squire, the cook, the pardoner, the wife of Bath, the clerk, the nun's priests, 26 in all, each of them coming from a different station in life, and each of them described with as much detail as you have in the monk's portrait. Each of them tells a quite different kind of tale. Some of them are classical histories and romances. Some of them are saints' lives. Some of them are miracles of the Virgin. Some of them, the one that I wrote my book about, there's only one of them, a beast fable. Some of them, satires. Some of the satires are directed right at each other. Chaucer's not a satirist, but if he wants to let people have it go at each other, the summoner will tell a scurrilous tale about the friar, and the friar will come back and tell a scurrilous tale about the summoner. Some of these tales are counterpointed. For instance, at the very beginning, the knight tells a very long Boccacian tale about love and chivalric martial ardor, and it goes on for many, many pages, very high-minded. The miller, who can't stand anything like that, tells his tale about what he knows love is really about, which is a fabliau. Chaucer's famous for his fabliau, that is tales that we would call extended dirty jokes. But the best dirty joke in literature is the Miller's Tale. So the Miller's Tale responds to this high-minded, high-class vision of love, saying this is what life is really about. And there are some farting scenes in this as well. Chaucer's rather renowned among students anyway, for the many farts that are to be found there. So an extraordinary collection of tales, perhaps the most renowned collection of 6 or 7 tales, all circle around the issue of marriage, the marriage debate. Started off by the wife of Bath. You all do know about the wife of Bath, probably, if not the most celebrated woman in English letters, one of the most celebrated women in English letters. Extraordinarily liberated, extraordinarily raunchy, extraordinarily outspoken. She takes on everybody. She's had 5 husbands, and she's off looking for her 6th, but she gets involved in a confession and in a kind of harangue directed at men especially, or anybody who wants to listen, protecting her own sect, her own sex, taking on all of the anti-feminist tirades that had been constructed for centuries after centuries after centuries, and embody some of them. You say that women are this, damn right we're this. You say them, damn right we're this. But also contending with one, she talks about the Aesopian story about the lion who's presented an image, a painting of a man killing a lion, and the lion said, who painted that? It's, in other words, who has been writing all of these scurrilous stories about women and how they're untrustworthy, et cetera, men. What if we, women, over those centuries had been writing the classical works of literature? We would have another story to tell. So she's taking on all of that. Chaucer, once he gets going with The Wife of Bath, can't stop. You can imagine how liberating it is for his own imagination. She takes on a very theological issue. Among a number of them, I'd mention sex. What about sex in marriage? Marriage is a sacrament, yes? So sex has to be in the sacrament of marriage, or else you're not going to procreate as God said you should. What about the pleasure attached to sex in marriage? Is that a good thing, or is that not a good thing? St. Augustine said, no, it's not a good thing. It's a venial sin. So right at the very center of a sacrament, you have a venial sin. And then there are all these other positions taken by St. Thomas Aquinas, of all things, way over on the left wing. This is all good. So she loves sex, she uses it as her own instruments of power and everything, but she's one of the most remarkable women in all of literature. And then there are a series of tales, some having to do tangentially with marriage, some of them taking them right on very directly. Chaucer finally has his chance to speak for himself on this pilgrimage. Because after all, he's not saying anything. All he says is time and again, don't blame me, blameth not me, I'm just writing this down. I was just traveling along. I had a tape recorder, okay? So if there's a fart or something like that, don't blame me, I'm a reporter, all right? So he finally is called upon by Harry Bailey. And Harry Bailey looks over at him and says, who's that little fat guy over there? He never seems to be saying anything. He looks so shy and bashful. And Harry brings him over, pats him on his tummy, and he says, oh, you're a cute guy. You're almost as fat as I am. Can you tell us a story finally? And Chaucer said, well, I remembered something a long time ago, and I'll tell it. I forgot to bring my text, but it is, how does it start off? List his Lord and good intent, and he will tell the veriment of to soon surpass. It is horrible. It is horrible. It is just the rhythm is all wrong. The level of diction is all wrong. The description of the hero is all wrong. They go off for an adventure, and then he turns around. He's ready to fight a three-headed giant, but the giant starts throwing stones at him. He goes home. It is everything wrong about poetry that could be imagined. Until, this is another handout I've given you. Until, you got it right there? This is at the very back of your handout. Page 676, the last few lines of Chaucer's tale of Sir Topas. Himself drank water of the well, and did the canique Sir Percival so wordily underrayed, till on a day, now more of this for God is dignity quader host. This is Harry saying, for God's sakes, shut up. For thou markest me so wary of the very lewdness that also weasely God me sorrow blesser, mean eris akin of the drasty specha, nu switcha ream the devil e betacha, this may well be ream doggerel, quod he. So Harry's estimation of the poetic achievement of this guy named Chaucer is not high. And Chaucer says, "Why so?" quod he. "Why will to let me more of me tale than another man, sin that is the best ream he can? Why do you cut me off like this? You didn't cut anybody else off. This is the best one I know. Be God," quod he, "for plainly at a word, thee drasty reaming is not worth a tord." I don't have to translate that, do I? "Thou dost not else but dispendeth team," etc. Now and then finally, and as Harry said, "Can you tell us another tale, something?" And Chaucer said, "Well, there is something else I know in prose, if you want me to do something in prose." And the thing he does in prose is about 30,000 words long, and it's all full of moralizings. But strangely, Harry liked it at the very end because he could remember some of these lines. That Sir Topas, Chaucer's poem, I would say is such a bad poem, it's a brilliant poem. It's a brilliantly bad poem. It takes a lot to make something so bad that it's good. So it's a parody, and it's actually an exploration of what poetry is all about and what makes poetry not work, also what makes poetry work. Okay, I've got just about, at most, 10 minutes to reach some kind of conclusion, to use a medieval word. The tales are told as progress is made to Canterbury. The tale that I have been invested in for so long is actually Beast Fable, where I think Chaucer is bringing together all of the issues that he had been concerned with, that had to deal with poetry throughout his career. It is a celebration of poetry. It's an ars poetica. It's extremely fun. Students love it. Everybody reads Chaucer, loves it. It's about a rooster, Chanticleer. Bring my book. Yeah. Rooster, Chanticleer, standing on. I found an artist down at Hanover, standing on books. His wife, who's also his sister, is also his paramour. Perdelote, and a fox, and it's an Aesopian fable. It is extremely rich with allusions. One scholar once tried to diagram it formally and said, I'm going to follow the tale, just the story. And there was almost nothing there. I mean, it's very, very simple. 10% of it is story, tale. The rest of it is all of these embellishments. These are all of these sort of poetical indulgences where Chaucer is playing, parodically in other ways, with rhetoric and with language, and also with some very profound intellectual issues that you wouldn't ever see right on the surface of it. But after writing that, 4 more tales follow. One is a tale of alchemy. Somebody comes in from the outside, and the next is an alchemist and tells a tale of alchemy. One is a tale of St. Cecilia, a tale of sort of transformation of the spirit. Thirdly, the last poem that Chaucer wrote is an awfully ugly tale taken from Ovid about a white crow that is transformed to a black crow, and his voice is taken away from him by Apollo, the god of music, harmony, and poetry. It is not the way you would like to see a poet end his career in his own craft. Then at the very end, the parson is called upon to tell his tale. They are approaching the end of the pilgrimage. Harry once again says, tell us something funny, tell us a poem, and the parson says, no more poetry. I will tell you something that will direct you in the direction of the New Jerusalem. This is the real pilgrimage. This is the spirit pilgrimage of the soul, of the spirit. And this is a treatise that Chaucer spent a lot of time writing on penance and penitence and satisfaction, and on the 7 deadly sins. Each of the 7 deadly sins parsed into all of its little twigs. There's the image of a tree and branches. And for each of the sins, fully articulated in all of its myriad parts. Then you have the 7 cardinal virtues, which are the correctives to those sins. So a kind of treatise and a handbook that you would hold, never read it from beginning to end or anything like that, although he calls it a merry tale, to think about who you are to lead a more examined life, so that perhaps there's a chance of your being saved at the end of time. At the very end of the Canterbury Tales, there's a short piece called The Retraction. In The Retraction, Chaucer calls almost all of the tales that he wrote his guilts, his crimes. And he beseeches God to forgive him, and beseeches his readers to forgive him for having written these works. Although at the beginning, before he gets to a wherefore, therefore, wherefore, he does say, he quotes St. Paul, Romans 14:4, all that is written for our doctrine. All that is written for our education, and that is mean intent. Chaucer quotes this in the Nun's Priest's Tale as well. In other words, a very liberal idea that no matter what a work of literature it is there for you to learn from. But then he takes a turn on a wherefore. So I want to conclude with so we have times for some questions, but in order to give a little bit of a punctuation of exclamation mark at the very end, in something I've written on the retraction, I dwell on that wherefore. And I say that actually, it takes time for me to get there, we are the wherefore. We are in that space between a position that thinks everything is written, or believes everything is written for our instruction, and a space where Chaucer says, I hold myself accountable for my works, and perhaps accountable for what misreadings or misapplications or misunderstandings or misdirections my poems might lead people in. We're in between as readers of Chaucer. I think Chaucer is so remarkable, I'd written down lots of reasons for this, but we're at the end of this talk, is that he is very generous to his readers in the hopes that they will not be disappointed that he has not preached to them, but that he's given them literature that is written for their and our doctrine. Thank you. So, let's have some questions. Yes?
I think you said in the beginning that Chaucer wasn't really known as a poet in his lifetime.
That's right.
When was his work sort of...
Soon afterwards, within a generation, he was being recognized as a major poet. There's a group of Scottish poets who are now called Scottish Chaucerians. There are people in England, Hoccleve, etc., who are imitating Chaucer. So it took almost no time to be recognized. In fact, I was reading something this morning where they said that he was recognized in his late lifetime. I don't know what they're thinking about. But he must have in his circle, reading his poems around, circulating those poems, have been appreciated as a major English poet. But it's astonishing that nobody put anything in writing, said, oh, we have Chaucer. Yeah.
Why didn't he have the same influence on the English language that Shakespeare did, if he was more or less equal?
Yeah. Well, Shakespeare made up a lot of words. He made up an awful lot of words. And I think probably Shakespeare has more quotable lines than Chaucer. There's a 19th century man of letters who talks about Chaucer, talks about Homer, talks about Shakespeare, and talks about Dante, and he says Chaucer has all of those things that those great poets has, but he lacks high seriousness. Matthew Arnold. He lacks high seriousness. And what he sort of means is, I can't quote a line from Chaucer that I can just hold on to and gives me a sense of the support system that a cultural system, that a culture is going to give me. That's true. But I think one of the great things about Chaucer, he's not going to give you, those easily memorable lines. In the film Shakespeare in Love, remember that a lot of, at least in the film, a lot of the lines that Shakespeare got from people in the streets like that. But yeah, we just know Shakespeare better. We see Shakespeare plays all the time. We don't have anything similar to that with Chaucer. But then, isn't that true of Milton? Not too many lines from Milton either. No, you talk about bardolatry, that the worship of the bard. That's what we have with Shakespeare, and we don't have it with our other poets. Good question. Yeah.
But in Chaucer's time, there still wasn't a uniform English language. Didn't people have different words for different things depending on their guilds?
Guilds? These are guilds? Mm-hmm. Because if you're in the Merchants Guild, you wouldn't speak the same as in, I don't think so. I mean, if you're in a guild in a city, you're speaking the same dialect. But if you're in a city 50 miles away,
Right.
there would be differences. 100 miles away, more differences. But not as radical as you might, as you might think. I remember seeing something on the BBC once. This is a modern thing in the English language, and they got people from two cities, 20th century cities in England, only 25 miles apart. They had trouble understanding each other. So there are instances like that. But it's not that, well, there are dialects. There's the Northwestern dialect, the Southwestern dialect. I remember studying all of those. But they did understand each other, and they could read each other. There would be some words that would seem a little bit, where did that come from? So,
But there was a universal choice, the choice of words that could be understood by more people than just within your village.
oh, sure. I mean, I'd say 90% of the time people would understand each other fine. But then there would be peculiar words that would only be true of this locality. Yeah.
Like difference between Maine and Georgia.
Sure, absolutely. And then you kind of have the accents and everything like that. Yeah. Yeah.
Chaucer is, you might say, translated you by versions that are in modern English.
Yeah.
What's two questions? What's the history of that going back, and what's your feeling and your comment on reading him in translation, if you will?
Hey, I co-edited, where are we? Here it is. This just recently called Approaches to Teaching Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And 36 articles by people who teach Chaucer around the country. And there was a questionnaire and everything that was sent out. It was done by the PMLA, the Modern Language Association. And one of the questions was, how do you feel about teaching Chaucer in translation? Or do you teach him the original? Wow! With something like 75 responses, 2 people said, I have to teach in translation, I hate doing it. Everybody wants to teach Chaucer in the original. And when students get into, it takes some time. But I work with them, and they make their own presentations. You know, we record them, we play them. They have musical accompaniment, things like that. And once they move into Middle English, and they hear somebody reading Chaucer badly, they're disgusted. Right? So just, I mean, that's maybe a little bit of an aside. So I would, not that everybody's going to go out and read and learn Middle English, but that's the way to deal with Chaucer. Translations. My wife and I were driving up and we were talking about how do I feel about translations, and there's finally a good one. Sheila Fisher, Norton, just came out about 2 years ago. Up until that time, I hated all of them. I mean, it was just so hard to listen to them. It's very hard to translate from one English, mode of English into another mode of English. So, because you're so close, but you're so far away. But I would recommend the Norton Sheila Fisher translation. She's an academic, but she's got a good ear. She's got the poet's touch. So is that how do I feel about it? Sure, but I would recommend that translation, and none of the others. Yeah.
When did pen rhyming start in English poetry?
Right. I thought I was going to get it a little bit because I was talking Old English. One of the things Chaucer brought in to the English language was iambic pentameter. Da-da, 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 da-da. We think that's what English poetry is. Not until Chaucer. Chaucer was clearly influenced by Italian. Go to Shakespeare, yes. Wallace Stevens, yes. Iambic pentameter. Now, rhyming couplets, Chaucer also brought that in. Well, iambic pentameter couplets, he brought that in. That's what you have in most of the Canterbury Tales, but not all of them. It goes in and out of fashion. In the 18th century, the heroic couplet was all iambic pentameter couplets. It's not easy to write rhyming iambic pentameter couplets and not get very boring and clunky. So that's one of the extraordinary accomplishments of Chaucer is that every rhyme is so wonderfully new and fresh. Is that an answer?
Yeah, I'm just curious why we jettisoned the alliteration of Beowulf in favor of...
Well, why we threw out the alliteration.
Yeah.
Well, in Chaucer's time, alliteration was very much in favor in the Northwest and in the country. Sir Gawain the Green Knight, all alliteration, fantastically brilliant poetry. Right? And Piers Plowman. Chaucer was sort of an elitist and a Southern guy who's more looking in the direction of Europe. But that alliterative revival, I mean, some people say that Sir Topaz is a mocking satire on the literature poems. I don't think so at all, although he's playing with that. But it did not, if you get up to Shakespeare's time, you see a little bit of alliteration, but not consistent alliteration, which is sort of too bad, because alliteration is fantastic. The Seamus Heaney's translation of Beowulf, very good poet, and so on, but he does not do much of alliteration. He avoids it, and that's a real loss. It's a real loss with our sense of what poetry is. We need more. Let's hear it for alliteration. Somebody else? Yeah.
Earlier you said that a lot of the tales aren't there, or that there's holes.
Yes.
Is it because we lost the documents, or he just never got around to writing them?
Some of the tales are interrupted. Some of them are not finished. And as to what happened with each of them, it's anybody's guess. I think in most cases it's deliberate. I mentioned the House of Fame. The House of Fame, it gets more and more chaotic up in the House of Fame. Everything's crazy. Everybody's yelling. Everybody's scrambling over everybody. And everybody's looking for fame. And there's a last line, he said, and then I saw a man of great authority. I see a man of great authority. And you sort of feel as reader, we've got there. Are we going to get the transcendent signified? It stops. It stops at the moment where you think you're going to get out of this crazy world. So that's a very deliberate cutting off of the tail. Chaucer's fascinated by endings, and we all are fascinated by endings. But I think in a few of his works, he just lost interest. Just a few.
Did he write for himself? I mean, he wrote them down himself. Did he write for money? I mean, Shakespeare was, of course, writing for plays and stuff. Did he expect to be paid for these, or what?
He was hoping to be paid for this. One of the last poems he wrote was to Henry IV, 1399. Just a new Lancaster king. A very dicey new political situation. It's called Complaint to My Purse. Complaint to my purse. And he's saying, he's using the trope of pregnancy and love, but my purse is so light. So it's supposed to be clever, but it's saying, look, I need some money. So he managed to make do, but he never managed to make much money. John Gower was his major patron. His wife actually helps him a lot because she was getting an annuity, but he was, in fact, this book I just mentioned has a view that in his last 2 or 3 years, when he's in the garden of Lady Mary Chapel outside Westminster Abbey, he was in dire poverty. So his last couple of years, now this is speculative, he did not, although his son after that, Thomas, did quite well. So did he do it for money? Absolutely he did it for money. What else? He could only live by patronage. The problem was, you had no guarantees. So oftentimes things were done on spec. You would make this manuscript, and then you give it as a gift, kneel, say some things, and then hope that maybe this person said, well, I really should pay you a little bit for that. Not an easy kind of lifestyle. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about what you said at the end about how weird a wherefore.
To say what?
How weird a wherefore. You were saying.
Oh, the wherefore, yes.
Sort of the bridge between Chaucer's apology and his original statement that all text should be taken as educational. Does that mean to give the reader the authority to decide what should be listened to and what should sort of be cast aside? Or did I understand that?
I think so. I think finally Chaucer is very generous. I think he's, I think his theory is of what does poetry make happen? Or to quote William Carlos Williams, it's difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. I think Chaucer felt that whatever it is that can happen magically in the internal chemistry of a reader, that something will turn you in the direction of the good, all right, or of the true. It's going to happen by such a complicated chemistry or alchemistry that no poet can pretend to think that he has control over that transformation. That's my theory. Yeah.
Slightly off topic, can you recommend a translation of Boccaccio? approach. I've been trying to work through it, and the text I have is terrible.
It's been some time. I can't right off. Maybe we can talk afterwards.
But Chaucer's Italian was sufficiently good so that he could read it.
It was sufficiently good. It was extremely good. It's impressively good. He got a few words wrong, but he got them wrong in very interesting ways.
Yeah, I was just wondering about the choice to write in English as opposed to the French or Latin. What consequences were there for him, and would he have been better off economically doing it in another language?
His exact contemporary, John Gower, wrote in those three languages, in Latin and in French and in English. And he did quite well. I think Chaucer was still more savvy in having decided to write in English, because in some ways French was a diminishingly important language. To write poetry in Latin in the 14th century takes you in a very ink-horny direction, really rather scholarly direction. I think Chaucer, sort of rather like maybe Dante, wanted to work with a vernacular, which was considered to be unpolished, maybe full of some kind of potential. All of Chaucer's readers certainly knew English through and through. But I think Chaucer's charge was to demonstrate that first-rate poetry can be written in this of this language, which is still the language of the people, of the folk. You might get other answers from other people. Yep.
When I was reading it, I was really shocked by the prioress's tale.
Yes.
Which is absolutely, seems on a different track than all the others.
Do you want me to talk about the tale, or you want to tell us what your impressions are?
Well, I mean, it's incredibly anti-Semitic.
Yes.
I mean, and it's the sort of thing that helped the cause of what happened in the 20th century.
Yes. I just mentioned the miracle of the Virgin. The prioress, who has a wonderful portrait in the general prologue, it's clear that she does not think of herself as first and foremost a person of spiritual. Well, I should be careful about this. As a person of, well, she does not think of herself very much as a prioress first. First, she thinks of herself as a lady, highly refined, and the descriptions that Chaucer gives us come out of French romance, things like that. And we see very little of her in her religious, conducting her religious life. And we might, and this is what happened with my students, I asked, what sort of tale would you expect to get from her? And they would say some kind of French romance, because that's where her imagination is, her self-image is. But in fact, she tells a Christian tale of a miracle of a young chorister, a young boy who in Asia, who walks through the street of a Jewish city, singing the Alma Redemptoris, a hymn in praise of the Virgin. He does not understand what he's singing. She herself, the prioress, in her prologue says, I think of myself as a child suckling at its mother's breast, pre-linguistic. She sort of identifies with the little, with the young, with the babyish, with the innocent. What happens to this boy is that the Jews collectively get a homicide, send him upon him, cuts his throat, throws him into the sewer, all right? And then they are, all the Jews, all of them, are arrested, tortured, torn apart, and done away with. And the boy sings with his throat cut in honor of the Virgin until a grain on his tongue is taken away, and the poem ends with a celebration of the love of the Virgin and mercy, mercy, mercy. The last 3 lines, mercy, mercy, mercy. Obviously anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism was rife in the Middle Ages. But was it this rife? I think you can talk about the tale critically, and psychoanalytically and everything, and not necessarily mention that the other are Jews, and still gets to what I finally feel is a deep pathology in her way of looking at the world. But, yes, anti-Semitism here, and when I go to the city of York, when I go to that tower, where you see where all the Jews went to die, when there was a pogrom, and the parish remembers Hugh of Lincoln, who was another one of these stories of Jewish atrocities against boys, little Christian boys. It's clear that Chaucer is showing that this woman is very dangerous, and that the Jews were no longer in England by this time. So yes, I guess your question is, what do we now in the 21st century do with the reading of this tale? We have to talk about the anti-Semitism, but I think we have to arrive at the anti-Semitism not by beginning with it, but seeing how that kind of psychology. I mean, one of my favorite lines from quite a different context is the last logical step in sentimentality is homicide. The last logical step in sentimentality is homicide. She is a sentimentalist, and she is dangerous. That's my quick riff on that.
Given current trends on college campuses in the news just very recently, do you foresee having difficulty teaching subjects like these that you've just been speaking about on your campus of Dartmouth? I'm sure this is a cycle, but within this cycle? Because that's a very touchy subject for the hypersensitive that we're now seeing on campuses.
Well, I myself have not had the kinds of difficulties that you do see sometimes in Yale and other places just recently. I think there are ways of approaching any kind of prejudice with people in your class who are the objects and who have suffered the effects of that prejudice from the time they were born. But one must do it in a way which is quite attentive to the emotional tendernesses and vulnerabilities, and et cetera. But I frankly don't subscribe to what seems to be in the air right now, the hyper-political correctness. All right. I think we can deal with it, or otherwise we're just not dealing with it.
I guess I'm following up with Prior's tale question. I think when you do, I think because Chaucer there's such a strong eye, like you mentioned, people do want to know, like, is this a nice man? Like, is he anti-Semitic, or is it just the tale? Is it the Priors, or is it Chaucer? Right. So I'm wondering, you were mentioning that you had just been reading the most recent book on a year in his life, and do you find it useful to actually give that context of his biography, or do you think that there's a slippage with the character of Geoffrey in the text? Like, to what extent is the biography helpful to us? I guess is my question.
Frankly, my answer is I don't think it's helpful, but I think it's important to do. There is a collection of studies by historians just came out last year, and all these different historians have taken one of Chaucer's pilgrims and gone into extraordinary empirical research as to what a nun's life was like and things like that. The question is, these are fictional characters. Are you really going to get any deeper by going into history? Getting to Chaucer, I think Chaucer is always playing peekaboo with his own self-image, that he is, and you were saying, we're always looking for Chaucer, and he said, oh, here I am, here, oh, yeah. And I think he never shows up. I think he deliberately never shows up, but he's nevertheless always there. He's always there. You feel his presence. But if you say, will the real Chaucer stand up? Or is this what Chaucer believes? I don't think you can say, I know for sure that he believes this, that. That is not the kind of writer Chaucer is. Milton, Absolutely, all right, and so on.
Did he get in trouble with the court or with the church?
Well, I don't think the church. I mean, there's an awful lot of very, very cruel treatment or very, very savage treatment of ecclesiastics. I mean, one satire after another of religious people in the pilgrimage. But everybody was doing that. Okay? So, I mean, I have to disabuse with my students of the idea, oh, here there's this monolithic church, and they're out to get you, and Chaucer was afraid in his deathbed or something like that. Politically, it is something else. And there are Chaucer critics who are historicists or Marxists or cultural materialists and so on, who insist that literature has to be understood as something that's not transcendent, embedded entirely in the politics and the historical events of its time. I absolutely agree. But to politicize Chaucer and say what he's really saying about these contemporary issues is a really difficult challenge. I think Chaucer avoids. I mean, I've written about there are 4 lines that refer to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in the most unpropitious of places. It's in the Beast of Babel I've written about. And it's so discordant with everything else. You've got to say, why in the world, in all of his writing, does he choose this site to bring an allusion to the most traumatizing experience in all of English history in the 14th century, and that's the Peasants' Revolt? A question to be asked. Well, what does Chaucer have to say? What is his position on the Peasants' Revolt? You look at his contemporaries, and they all absolutely are in horror, all right? Absolutely 100% condemnation of those who were involved in the revolt. Some of them were a little bit more sympathetic before the revolt. Chaucer, you just don't know. So I think, he's covering himself, right? But I don't think there's anything feckless about it. I don't think he's just, what would the word be? A moral trimmer or a political trimmer at every turn.
Yeah, just follow up my previous other question about how do you expect to make a living at this, and you say he had, occurred to me, there was no printing press then, so he would have had to, if you were going to sell this at all, you have to have some single, really wealthy patron for a single copy, or is there anything that would have to be hand manuscripts after that? And I just wonder, were there any poet or writers that had made a living writing before Chaucer?
By publishing their own work? Well, it was the publishers who made the money. They would put together the books. Sometimes you would go to a publishing house, a printer, and say, I would like such and such a thing made. You could have it done and then carry it over to somebody who would like to see it bought.
But these will all be in manuscripts?
Oh yeah, that's all it can be.
And printers were made?
No printing houses. 1480.
You said bring them to a printer.
Oh, I'm sorry. Bring it to a scribe. Yeah.
Do you think that Chaucer had a primary goal with his writings? Anything that where you saw sort of I'm asking this impossible question. A theme being repeated with various stories to just did you identify certain
that's what I think I was going to sort of entertain at the very end. I think, first of all, he wanted to entertain. I really do. He wanted people to enjoy his poetry. And he wanted his poetry to be read at whatever level you were comfortable at. He was unlike Dante. Dante was almost, if you can't read me the right way, if you don't know what allegory is, Chaucer says, you enjoy it that way, you enjoy it this way, you enjoy it that way. But my experience, Sean, is that the more pressure, gentle pressure you put on his poetry, the more it generously opens itself up to you, and the more you see that there are more and more ways of reading it. The most high-minded question was that I put these tales on the road to Canterbury because I would hope that these tales would lead you in the direction of salvation. If you were Dante, you'd say, absolutely. That's my poema sacrum. I am your savior because I am the poet of the ages, says Dante. Not Chaucer. But I think there's a little bit in the metaphor of the pilgrimage that says maybe poetry is self-image. Maybe it is transformative. Maybe it does some good in the world. But then, remember the retraction? Maybe not. Yeah.
Is there something like Rosetta Stone for learning Middle English?
Well, you know, if you were to email me, I have a wonderful little 7-page thing on how to pronounce different English.
You've got to hear it to get it
Yeah.
right.
I think if you went online, you'd find it pretty fast. There's a Harvard site called Labyrinth. Do you know, I mean, where would you
The
go?
Harvard site.
The Harvard site.
Is that right?
There's lots of recordings. I think you can find a lot of good.
Yeah. It's not that hard. The thing is, there's something that's called the great vowel shift. And every long vowel, 5 of them, changed between 1400 and 1600. So you have to go back through those changes. That's why it sounds more like a continental language, because they didn't change. And once you get that, and you know, at a certain moment, your mind just flips and you can get into it. Yeah.
Can you say something about the alchemy?
Okay. So, they're on the way, a long way, and all of a sudden these two figures come riding pell-mell in their direction, and they are obviously very exercised. One of them, they both are strange looking, one of them all in black and so on. And the other one was the yeoman, the other was Candy. And they start talking, and the yeoman starts talking a little bit too much. He said, "Who are you? What are you doing? Da-da-da-da-da." And then he starts talking about his master, who was an alchemist. And his master finally leaves because he was worried about what they're going to do to him. He probably was in a very shady relationship to his craft. Lots of ambivalence about whether or not alchemy is a science or not in Chaucer's time. So the yeoman, who doesn't understand what he was doing for 7 years working for his master, but he's learned all the words and the buzzwords and the language, and so he tries to describe what's going on, and inside there's a con game, etc. Very strange, odd tale. Obviously Chaucer knows his alchemy backwards and forwards. My own take on it is that towards the end of his career, or the Canterbury Tales, he's dealing with various symbols of transformation. You know, the alchemy is obviously an attempt to change something from a lower state of being to a higher state of being. You could say, without getting too crude about it, is poetry, you know, alchemical, or is it not? Nobody's really, you know, sort of nailed the Canis Yeoman's tale, but a lot of people have got very learned about alchemy, and I got into it for a while. So what can I say about alchemy? I don't tend to teach it. I did write something on it once, not terribly convincing, but I just wanted to become, you know, immured in alchemy for a while. I've forgotten all the lore now. It's a world unto itself. Don't go there. Okay, yes?
Just a footnote. You said something before about something that had come to light about his favorite scribe.
Oh, yeah.
I wonder if scribal variance was a reason he was his favorite.
Oh, the reason, I mean, in his poem to Adam Scrivain, just a 7-line poem, he essentially says, "Adam, may the pox fall on your hair, and may it all fall out, unless next time round you are more true to what I send you, and that I will not have to rub and scrappa the way I have had to. That is, I've had to go over your manuscript and rub out and scrape out and then put it back in, and damn be you for doing all that. You are a lousy scribe, and I will curse you with the pox if you ever do that again." So we thought, Adam, who's Adam? Adam's just, you know, but in fact, Adam, somebody named Adam Pinkhurst, has been discovered by somebody who's been working with the manuscripts. I don't know if Chelsea's been terribly excited about this, but okay, now we have a name for it. But there was a real scribe named Adam, and he also, interestingly enough, he actually described for both major manuscripts, which...
You know, the big pox in those days was cutaneous syphilis. The smallpox was, that's why they call it the smallpox. The big pox was cutaneous syphilis.
Thank you.
Good curse.
Yes, so be careful when you I think, thank you so much.